The rain had been coming down since first light, and it turned the depot yard into a sheet of gray water that reflected the 12 buses back at themselves, so that there seemed to be 24 of them, all dead. Faye Whitmore stood at the back of the small crowd with her hood up and her hands in her pockets and watched the auctioneer climb the 2 wet steps onto the loading platform. There were perhaps 30 people in the yard, scrap men mostly. A couple of fellows from a breaker's yard out near the motorway who turned good engineering into weight by the ton and didn't lose any sleep over it. A man from a film company who wanted a bus to blow up. Nobody who mattered. Nobody who knew. That was the part she kept turning over. Nobody in this yard knew what they were looking at except her, and she had spent 11 years learning not to say what she knew out loud, because every time she had, it had cost her. Lot 1, the auctioneer called, and his voice bounced off the corrugated sheds. 12 Haldane hydrogen single-deckers registered 4 years ago, removed from service, sold as seen as scrap, no warranty, no certification transferred, buyer collects. He paused and let the rain fill the gap. Who'll start me? Anyone. They weigh near 11 ton apiece in steel and aluminum alone. Up on the gantry above the platform, dry under the overhang, Hugo Strand watched the proceedings with the particular boredom of a man supervising the removal of an embarrassment. He had a coat that cost more than the auctioneer's car and the easy stillness of someone who had never in his life worried about the next month. Beside him stood Quentin Driscoll, his finance director, holding an umbrella over them both, though they were already undercover, because that was the shape of their relationship. Strand had not seen Faye, or he had, and she'd stopped registering the way furniture stops registering. She found, standing in the rain that morning, that she didn't mind either way. 200, said one of the breaker's men. 200, I'm bid. 500, the film man. It went up in lazy little jumps, the way prices go when everyone in the room has decided the same low ceiling. 800, 850. The breaker's man scratched his neck and decided 11 tons of mixed metal across 12 vehicles, once you'd paid to cut them and move them, wasn't worth more than 900 to him, and shook his head. 900 going once. 1,000, Faye said. She didn't shout it. She'd learned long ago that the people who get listened to are rarely the ones who raise their voices. She just said it clearly into the gap and pushed her hood back so the auctioneer could see her face. Heads turned. $1,000 was nothing. It was a good suit, a cheap holiday, but it was 100 more than anyone else thought the lot was worth, and so it bought her a second of attention, which up on the gantry found its way to Hugo Strand. She watched him recognize her. She watched it happen in stages, the way you watch a man do mental arithmetic he'd rather not. First the flicker of who is that, then the click of asterisk oh asterisk, then the small cruel curl at the corner of his mouth that she'd seen 100 times in meetings, the expression of a man enjoying a private joke at someone else's expense. He leaned to Driscoll and said something. Driscoll laughed. The laugh carried down through the rain just enough. 1,000, the lady at the back, the auctioneer said, almost grateful. Any advance on 1,000? No, sold, the lady at the back, lot 1, 12 vehicles, 1,000. The hammer came down on a folded newspaper because he didn't have a proper one. And that was how Faye Whitmore came to own 12 buses that the company which had employed her for 9 years and then dismissed her, had sworn under 3 separate engineering signatures, were beyond economic repair. Strand was waiting when she came to sign the paperwork in the site office. He'd come down off the gantry specially, which told her she'd irritated him, which she found she enjoyed more than was sensible. Faye, he said her name like he was doing her a favor by remembering it. I'd heard you'd gone off to do consultancy, couldn't picture it, I'll be honest, and now here you are buying scrap in the rain, £1,000 for 12 bricks. He shook his head with theatrical sorrow. Sentiment, is it? You always were sentimental about those buses. I suppose a girl gets attached. Something like that, she said and signed. You know they don't run. He said it gently, the way you correct a child. We tried everything. Haldane tried everything. The stacks are gone. You'd spend $250,000 a vehicle trying to bring them back and you'd still have 12 dead buses and an empty bank account. I'm telling you this as a kindness. I appreciate the kindness. What are you going to do with them? She tucked the receipt into her inside pocket where it would stay dry. I'm going to fix them, she said, and watched his face and saw nothing change in it, because Hugo Strand had never once believed she could do a thing he couldn't, and that, more than anything else, was the mistake he was going to spend the next 6 months paying for. You have to go back to understand the buses, and to understand the buses you have to understand Donald Whitmore, who drove the number 9 for 31 years and never once called in sick. The number 9 ran from the city center out to the Marbeck estate and the big hospital that sat between them, and it was the kind of route that didn't make money and never would. The people who rode it were the people who didn't have other ways of getting places. Old women going to the day hospital, kids going to the college. Night cleaners, care workers, the whole quiet machinery of a city that the city itself rarely looked at. Donald had driven them for 3 decades and known half of them by name, and when he died, sudden, on a Sunday with the football on, 300 people came to the crematorium, which surprised everyone except Faye, who had grown up understanding that her father was the most important person on a route that no spreadsheet would ever value correctly. She'd gone into engineering partly because of him and partly to get away from him, the way you do at 20, and she'd been good at it in a way that frightened her teachers a little. She had a particular gift, which was hard to explain and impossible to teach. She could feel where a system was lying. Give her a fault that vanished when you looked at it, the intermittent ones, the ghosts that ate other engineers alive, and she'd sit with the data until the data confessed. It was less like calculation than like listening. She joined Calder Transit's engineering team because it was home, because the number 9 still ran, because somewhere in her there was a girl who wanted the buses her father drove to be good buses, and for a while it had been the right place. Then the hydrogen program came. The 12 Haldane fuel cell buses had been Calder's great green gamble, bought with a government grant and a fanfare and a photograph of Hugo Strand shaking hands with a minister. They were genuinely good machines. Quiet, clean, the future arriving 4 years early. Faye had been the system's lead on bringing them into service, and she'd loved them with the slightly embarrassing intensity engineers reserve for things that work beautifully. Then 18 months in, they'd started to derate, one by one. A fuel cell bus that should hold full power would suddenly throttle itself back, the dashboard throwing a stack temperature fault, the bus limping into the depot at half power. Haldane's field engineers came up, ran their diagnostics, and delivered the verdict that suited everyone. The fuel cell stacks were degrading prematurely. Catastrophic. Out of warranty by a whisker. $250,000 a vehicle to replace. Faye hadn't believed it. The stacks were the most expensive part and the easiest thing to blame, and the fault didn't behave the way a dying stack behaved. A dying stack got worse steadily, predictably, like an old man's knees. This came and went. It was worse in the mornings and after the buses had stood. It correlated, she'd shown them the graph, she'd shown them 3 times with humidity, with damp. She'd been certain it was the humidification control. The fuel cells needed their membranes kept at exactly the right moisture. Too dry and they choked, and a fleeking humidity sensor combined with a lazy bit of control software was telling the system the membranes were wetter than they were, so the system dried them out. So the stack choked and derated and threw a temperature fault that was really a moisture fault wearing a disguise. A sensor. A firmware patch. 40,000 pounds across the whole fleet, she'd estimated, and a fortnight's work. Nobody had wanted to hear it. She understood why now, though she hadn't fully then. If the buses were dying of natural causes, premature stack failure, then Calder could write them off, claim against the residual value insurance the grant had required, and book the loss cleanly. If the buses were dying of a known, cheap, fixable fault that Haldane and Calder had between them failed to diagnose for a year, then somebody had been negligent, and the insurance wouldn't pay, and there would be questions about the grant, and the whole shining green flagship would turn into a scandal with photographs. Dead of natural causes was worth millions to Hugo Strand. Fixable was a liability. So the engineering report said stack failure, beyond economic repair asterisk, and Faye had refused to sign hers, and that had been the beginning of the end. Difficult, not a team player, couldn't accept the consensus of senior colleagues. There'd been a restructure, conveniently, and her role had been absorbed, and she'd been walked out with a settlement and an agreement she'd signed because she was tired and her mortgage didn't care about her principals. That had been 7 months before the rain and the auction. What Strand didn't know, what nobody knew, was that on her last afternoon, while HR processed her exit, Faye had sat at her desk and done the one thing she allowed herself. She'd copied onto her own personal drive, with full legal entitlement because it was her own authored work, every diagnostic log, every graph, every report she had personally written, including the 3 memos in which she had identified the humidification fault, costed the fix, and recommended it, each one stamped with a date, each one ignored. She hadn't known yet what she'd use them for. She'd just known you don't throw away the truth when it's the only thing they can't take off you. The unit she rented sat on a dead industrial estate on the wrong side of Calder Bridge, a drafty steel shed that had last housed a firm that made conservatory fittings until it didn't. It cost her most of what was left of her settlement to take it for a year, and to pay the low loader to move the 12 buses across the city, 2 at a time, over the course of a fortnight. She moved into a problem she'd never had at Calder, which was that she was now entirely alone, and 12 buses are a great deal of machine for one woman with a multimeter. Ray Coleman fixed that. Ray had been a fitter at the depot for 40 years and had taken his redundancy the same month Faye took her settlement, in the same restructure, and he'd spent the time since being slowly driven mad by his wife's view that retirement was a thing he should enjoy. When Faye rang him, he listened to about 90 seconds of explanation, said, "The bloody humidifiers, I always said," and turned up the next morning in his own overalls with his own tools, and named a wage that was an insult to his skill, and refused to discuss it. "I'm not doing it for the money," he said when she tried. "I'm doing it because Strand told me to my face those buses were knackered, and Strand wouldn't know a fuel cell from a kettle, and I'd like to be in the room when he finds out he was wrong." He looked at the 12 dead buses with something close to affection. "Also, I drove past Marbeck last week. Number 9's down to 1 bus an hour now. Donald have something to say about that." The third member of the firm arrived by accident. Daisy Mensah was 19 and had been 3 months into an apprenticeship at Calder when the hydrogen program was canned and her apprenticeship with it, and she'd been stacking shelves ever since and hating it. Ray knew her uncle. She turned up on a Saturday, just to look, and by Sunday she had her hands inside a fuel cell module and the particular quiet of a young person who has found the thing they're for. "They told me these were broken," Daisy said on her second week, wiping her hands. "At Calder, they told the whole apprentice intake, used them as an example. This is what happens when you bet on unproven technology." She frowned. "But they're not broken, are they? Not really?" "No," Faye said. "They're not broken. They were misdiagnosed by people who needed them to be broken." She handed Daisy a humidity sensor, the size of a thumb, that cost £11. This told a lie, and the software believed it because nobody told the software not to. That's all. £11 and a lie. And the company wrote off 12 buses over an £11 sensor. The company wrote off 12 buses because it was worth more to them dead than alive. Faye said it without heat. She'd burned through the heat months ago, What was left was colder and more useful. Remember that. The most dangerous fault in any system isn't the broken part. It's the person who profits from the diagnosis. The work itself was not in the end dramatic. Most real work isn't. They started with bus number 4, which had been the first to fail and the worst, on the theory that if they could bring 4 back they could bring any of them back. Faye pulled the humidification data. The buses logged everything, and the logs were hers to read now. And there it was again, the same lie she'd seen 2 years ago, the moisture sensor reporting wet when the membrane was bone dry, the control system dutifully drying out a stack that was already gasping. She replaced the sensor, 11 pounds. Then came the part that was actually hers, the part Haldane had never managed and Calder had never paid for. She rewrote the humidification control logic, not the whole thing, a patch. A few hundred lines that taught the system to cross-check the dodgy sensor against 3 other readings it already had and ignore it when it disagreed with all 3. She designed it in her head 2 years before, in a meeting where nobody was listening. Now she had a laptop and a bus and nobody to stop her, and it took her 4 days and 3 rewrites and 1 bad night where she got it wrong, and the bus wouldn't boot at all and Ray talked her down with tea at midnight. On the 5th day they pressurized the tanks, carefully, hydrogen being hydrogen, with the big doors open and the gas alarms armed, and Daisy turned the key and bus number 4 came up clean. Full power. No fault. They drove it round and round the empty estate roads outside the unit until the tanks ran low, and it never derated once, not in the cold, not in the wet, not after standing. And Ray, who had spent 40 years not showing his feelings about machines, put his hand flat on the warm flank of it and didn't say anything for a while. 11 more, Faye said. The other 11 went faster because now they knew the shape of it. By the end of the 3rd month all 12 buses started, ran, held full power and threw no faults. 12 clean, quiet, zero-emission single-deckers, sitting in a drafty shed on the wrong side of town, owned outright, free and clear, by a woman who'd paid £1,000 for the lot. And here was the thing Hugo Strand had never once thought to consider. The thing that turned 12 working buses from a satisfying private vindication into something else entirely. They were still certified. The certification was the part nobody at the auction had understood, because you had to know the regulations the way Faye knew them, which was to say from the inside, because she'd helped write the homologation file when the buses went into service. Each of those 12 buses carried a full type approval and, crucially, a zero-emission capable certification under the old framework, the framework that predated the new Northern Clean Air mandate. When Calder had declared the buses scrap, they'd surrendered the * fleet operating license, the permission for Calder to run them. But the * vehicle certification itself, the proof that these specific machines met the emissions and safety standard attached to the vehicles, not the operator. It traveled with the buses. It was on the paperwork Faye had signed for, in the line the auctioneer had read out and nobody had listened to. No certification transferred. He'd meant the operating license. He hadn't understood that the type approval didn't need transferring. It was already baked into the vehicles, like a hallmark stamped into silver. And the Northern Clean Air mandate was about to make that hallmark worth a fortune. Faye had known the mandate was coming for 2 years, because she read policy the way her father had read the racing pages, and because part of her old job had been horizon scanning for exactly this. The mandate was the city region's flagship. From a fixed date, every bus operating on a contracted route inside the Calderbridge boundary had to be zero-emission and carry current certification under an approved framework. Operators had been given a runway to comply. Most had spent it doing nothing, the way people do. But here was the cruelty hidden in the regulation, the detail buried in an annex that Faye had read 3 times to be sure. To limit gaming, the mandate had frozen the list of approved certification frameworks 18 months before the deadline. Any vehicle certified under the old framework before the freeze was automatically grandfathered in, instantly compliant. Any vehicle that wasn't already certified had to go through the new framework, and the new framework's testing queue was 18 months long, and the deadline was 4 months away. In plain terms, if you didn't already own zero-emission buses with valid pre-freeze certification, you could not legally get any in time. You could buy brand new electric buses tomorrow, and they would sit useless until they'd crawled through an 18-month certification queue, by which point you'd have lost the contract. There were, Faye had calculated, somewhere between 40 and 60 grandfathered, certified zero-emission buses in the entire country sitting outside the existing big fleets and theoretically available, and 12 of them working, clean, fully compliant, available immediately, were sitting in her shed. She didn't tell Ray and Daisy the whole of it at first, not because she didn't trust them, but because she'd learned that a truth let out too early gets spent before it ripens. She told them they were going to sell the buses, and that they'd do well out of it, and that they should both keep working because she'd need them. What she'd actually understood, sitting up the night the 12th bus came clean, was this. The Northern Combined Authority was about to put out to tender the contract to run the Western Route network, including the number 9, under the new mandate. Whoever won would need compliant buses on day one. The number 9, her father's route, the lifeline to Marbeck and the hospital, was specifically named in the consultation as at risk, because no bidder could demonstrate a compliant fleet in time. 12 buses, the exact number near enough to run the Western network, the only certified, available, working fleet within reach. She wasn't selling scrap. She was holding the one key to a door the entire region needed to walk through, and she'd bought it for £1,000 from the man who'd thrown it away. The first person to come sniffing was a journalist, which Faye should have expected and hadn't. Carries Bell wrote for the *Calderbridge Examiner, and had a beat that covered the council and the transport authority, and a nose for the gap between what powerful men announced and what was true. She'd been at the minister's photo op 4 years before. She remembered the hydrogen buses, and she'd heard, the way reporters hear things, that 12 of them were apparently being driven round an industrial estate on the wrong side of town by a woman and an old man. She turned up unannounced on a wet Tuesday and stood in the doorway of the unit watching bus number 9. Faye had renumbered them privately, sentimentally, purr past her at full power, and she said, "Those are dead." The council was told those were dead. There's a line in the budget about writing those off, 11.4 million. 11.4, Faye hadn't known the exact figure. It was higher than she'd guessed. Is that what they claimed? That's what Calder wrote off, and that's what the insurance and the grant clawback covered. Premature stack failure. Carries looked at the bus, then at Faye, then at the bus. That doesn't look like premature stack failure. That looks like a bus. It is a bus. How many of them run? All of them. Carries Bell got out a notebook, then thought better of it and put it away, which Faye respected. "Who are you?" she asked, not aggressive. Genuinely puzzled, the way people are puzzled when the story they've been told and the thing in front of them won't line up. Because somebody told the council, in writing with engineering signatures, that fixing these was impossible, and you've apparently fixed all 12 in a shed with a man old enough to be your dad. So either you're some kind of genius nobody's heard of, or somebody lied to the council for £11.4 million, and I'd quite like to know which. Both, Faye said. It's both. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and she watched the journalist understand that she'd walked into something much larger than a quirky local story about an eccentric woman and some old buses, and she watched Carries Bell decide, the way good reporters do, to be careful. "I'm not ready for you to write anything yet," Faye said. "There's a tender coming. If you write it now, it warns the people who need warning, and I lose the only advantage I have. Give me 6 weeks, and in return, when it does break, you have it first, all of it, the memos, the dates, everything. You'll have the whole of it before anyone. Carries looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this a great deal. I've thought about almost nothing else for 2 years. What did they do to you? Faye considered the question. They told me I was wrong, she said, in a way that cost me my job and my reputation and the work I loved, and they did it because being wrong about me was cheaper for them than being right. And the thing is, Ms. Bell, I genuinely didn't mind being walked out. People get walked out. What I minded, she stopped, and was surprised to find the old heat there after all, banked but not dead. What I minded was that they used the buses to do it. They broke a true thing on purpose, and they made the breaking my fault, and then they sold the wreckage. And I'm going to make them watch me sell it back. Hugo Strand found out in the worst possible way, which was last. The way it reached him was this. Pennine Mobility Partners, a serious operator, well-funded, hungry, run by a sharp and unsentimental woman whose name does not matter to this story except that she knew value when she saw it, had decided to bid for the Western network. Their problem was the same as everyone's. They had no compliant fleet and no way to get one in time, which meant their bid was a bluff, and they knew it, and they were quietly preparing to either withdraw or lowball and hope. Then their procurement lead, a careful man named Adrian Cole, doing the kind of due diligence careful men do, found a strange thing in the National Certification Register. 12 Haldane fuel cell buses, certified pre-freeze, grandfathered, fully compliant, and listed under a recent ownership change, not to any operator but to a private individual, F. Whitmore. Adrian Cole, being careful, looked up F. Whitmore. He found a former Calder Systems engineer with a quietly extraordinary record and an exit that smelled, to a careful man, of something swept under a rug. And he came to the shed on the wrong side of Calderbridge himself, alone, and he watched 12 buses run, and he sat with Faye for 3 hours, and at the end of it he understood that the woman across the table was not a lucky scrap dealer who'd stumbled onto a windfall. She was an engineer who had seen the entire board 2 years in advance and made one quiet move and waited. You could sell us the buses outright, Cole said. Name a price. We win the contract, we run the network, everyone's happy. I could, Faye agreed, or you could understand that the buses on their own are worth what 12 buses are worth. But 12 certified buses, the only compliant fleet available before the deadline, the difference between you winning the Western network and not bidding at all, she let it sit. That's not worth what 12 buses are worth. That's worth what the network is worth to you, over the contract term, which I've estimated and I expect you've estimated, and I expect we've landed on similar numbers. Adrian Cole, to his credit, smiled. It was the smile of a man who has come to take advantage of a situation and discovered the situation is several moves ahead of him. And the number you've landed on. 10 million, Faye said. For the 12 buses, the certification, my firmware, and a 2-year support contract so they keep running, because they will keep running, because I'm the only person alive who actually understands why they failed and why they don't fail anymore. She slid a single sheet across the table. Your own analysts will tell you the Western network is worth more than that to you over the term, and that without me you can't bid at all. So it's not really a question of whether 10 million is a lot for 12 buses. It's a question of whether 10 million is a lot for the thing you actually need, which is to exist in this market at all. Cole read the sheet. He didn't argue with the number. Careful men don't argue with numbers that are correct. There's a complication, he said. If we do this and we bid and we win, Calder is bidding too. Strand's bidding for the same network. He'll lose because he can't field a compliant fleet either. But when he loses and then sees 12 of his own old buses running it, he'll come apart, Faye said. Yes, I know, I'm counting on it. But he came to the shed. She'd known he would, once word reached him, and word reached him about a week before the tender hearing, because these things leak no matter how careful everyone is. He came alone, which surprised her, and he came in the evening, which didn't, because men like Hugo Strand prefer to do their important business where there are no witnesses. He stood in the doorway in his good coat and looked at the 12 buses lined up clean and quiet and ready. And for a moment, just a moment, she saw the truth of it land on him, the full weight, and it was almost worth the 2 years on its own. "You," he said. "Me? Hell." "A sensor and some software, Hugo, like I told you. Like I told everyone 2 years ago 3 times in writing." She didn't move from where she sat on the step of bus number 9 with a mug of tea. £40,000 in a fortnight. You'll remember I costed it. You'll remember you ignored it. You'll remember why. His face did the arithmetic she'd watched it do at the auction, but faster and worse, because now the answer was much larger. "These are my buses," he said. "They were your buses. You sold them to me for £1,000. There's a receipt. I keep it laminated." She sipped her tea. "Sold as seen as scrap, no warranty. Your auctioneer was very clear. Your finance director countersigned. It's a beautiful piece of paper, Hugo. It's the best £1,000 I've ever spent. The firmware is Calder Intellectual Property. The firmware is mine. I wrote it after I left on my own equipment in my own time from scratch with no Calder materials, and I can prove every keystroke because I've learned the hard way to keep records." She finally stood, and she was taller than him in the work boots, which she enjoyed more than was dignified. "You're going to threaten me with lawyers now. I can see you reaching for it. So let me save you the money. I have every log, every graph. The 3 memos where I identified the fault, costed the fix, and recommended it, all dated, all ignored, all signed off as received by you. I have the gap between what you told the council and the truth, which is £11.4 million wide. And I have a journalist who has all of it too, sitting in a sealed envelope, set to open if anything happens to me or my buses or my deal." She let that one sit. "So, by all means, lawyers." She watched him understand that he had walked into the shed to threaten her and was leaving it threatened, and that there was no move on the board that didn't end with the council asking him where £11.4 million had gone and why the buses he'd sworn were dead were running the route he'd lost. "What do you want?" he said, and the question came out smaller than he meant it to. "Nothing from you," she said, and she meant it, and that was the part he found unbearable. "I don't want your money or your apology or your job. I had all of those once and you took them and it turned out I didn't need them after all. I just want you to be in the room next Thursday. That's all. I want you to be in the room." The tender hearing was held in the Combined Authorities' main chamber, a horseshoe of pale wood and microphones, public gallery half full. The regional press present because the Western Network and the fate of the Atrisque routes had become, thanks partly to a few careful articles by Carey's Bell that hinted without revealing, a story the city was watching. Marion Frost chaired it. She ran the transport board, and she'd inherited the £11.4 million write-off in the budget she'd been handed and had never been comfortable with it. And she had the particular alertness of an official who suspects she's been told a tidy story about an untidy thing. The bids were presented in turn. Calder went first, Hugo Strand himself, polished, confident, promising a transition to compliant vehicles that everyone in the room who understood the certification freeze knew was undeliverable because there were no buses for him to transition to. He didn't mention that. He talked about heritage and reliability and the Calder name. He was good. He'd always been good in rooms. It was the only thing he was actually good at. Then Pennine Mobility Partners. Adrian Cole presented, calm and exact, and he came to the slide that mattered and he said, "Unlike the other bidders, Pennine can field a fully compliant, certified, zero-emission fleet on day 1 of the contract. Not a transition plan, not a promise. 12 buses certified under the grandfathered framework, fully operational, available immediately, ready to serve the Western Network including the Atrisque routes." He paused. "Including the number 9. Faye in the public gallery watched Marion Frost sit forward. 12 certified zero-emission buses, Frost repeated. Available immediately. Mr. Cole, the board was advised that no such fleet existed within reach of this region. We were told the only such vehicles locally had been written off as unrepairable. To the tune, she glanced at her papers, of a significant sum. Where exactly did Penn source a compliant fleet? This was the moment. Faye had built the whole of it toward this moment, and she'd thought, in the planning, that she'd want to stand and claim it, the way you dream of the vindication. But sitting there she found she didn't want to stand at all. She wanted Cole to say it plainly into the microphones, so that it landed not as a wronged woman's grievance but as a simple fact established by a serious operator before a public board. We acquired them, Cole said, from a private engineer, 12 Haldane fuel cell buses. The same 12, in fact, that were sold by Calder Transit at auction as scrap, for £1,000, on the basis of engineering reports stating they were beyond economic repair. He let that settle into the chamber. The engineer who bought them identified the actual fault, a faulty humidity sensor and a software error, a fault she had, we've established, formally documented and recommended fixing 2 years ago, while still employed at Calder for an estimated cost of £40,000. Her recommendation was not acted upon. The buses were instead written off as unrepairable. She repaired all 12. They now run perfectly. We have the engineering data, and so does she. The silence in the chamber was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of 40 people doing the same sum at once. Marion Frost turned slowly to where Hugo Strand sat with his polished folder and his Calder name. "Mr. Strand," she said, "this board wrote off £11.4 million on your advice that these vehicles were beyond repair. I'm now told they were repaired for the price of a sensor by someone who told you, in writing 2 years ago, that they could be. Would you like to address that?" He stood because he had to. He opened his mouth because he had to. And Faye, watching from the gallery, saw the thing she had waited 2 years to see, which was not triumph and not fear but something worse for a man like him. She saw Hugo Strand have nothing to say. The room had always been his only weapon, and for the first time in his life the room was not on his side, because the room had just been handed the truth in plain figures, and there is no charm that survives plain figures. The diagnosis was made in good faith by qualified engineers, he managed. 3 of whom reported to you, Frost said, and 1 of whom, the system's lead, refused to sign it, I'm now given to understand, and left the company shortly afterward. Is that the engineer who repaired the buses, Mr. Strand? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Carrie's bell in the press row was writing very fast. Penn won the Western Network, of course. There was never any real question once the certified fleet was on the table. The rules made it nearly automatic, and the rules had been written, with an irony Faye savored privately, to reward exactly the kind of foresight she'd shown and punish exactly the kind of cynicism Strand had shown. The deal closed the following week. £10 million for 12 buses, the certification, the firmware, and a 2-year support contract with Faye Whitmore Engineering Limited, a company that had existed for 4 months and had 3 employees and was about to need a great many more. She signed it in a glass-walled meeting room with Adrian Cole and 2 lawyers, and when the lawyers had gone, she sat for a moment with the strange weightlessness of having finished a thing she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was heavy. "Can I ask you something?" Cole said. "Off the record, the buses on their own, even certified, we'd have paid a strong price. You knew that, but you held out for the network value, $10 million. You could have lost the whole thing pushing that hard. Most people would have taken 3 and been delighted." He studied her. "Why risk it?" Faye thought about Donald, 31 years on the number 9, 300 people at the crematorium, a value no spreadsheet had ever computed correctly. "Because they taught me a lesson," she said. 2 years ago, they taught me that a thing is worth exactly what the most powerful person in the room says it's worth, regardless of the truth. They said the buses were worth nothing, and so the buses were worth nothing, and they said I was worth nothing, and so," she shrugged, I just wanted to find out if the lesson was true, whether the truth eventually wins, or whether it's only ever worth what the powerful let it be worth. She looked at the signed contract. Turns out the truth was worth £10 million. It just needed someone willing to wait for the market to catch up with it. The consequences for Hugo Strand did not come as a thunderbolt, because real consequences rarely do. They came the way water comes through a ceiling, slowly, then all at once. The combined authority referred the $11.4 million write-off to its audit committee. The audit committee, armed with the dated memos that Carrie Bell published in full the morning after the hearing, Phase 3 warnings, the costings, the signatures acknowledging receipt, found that Calder had at best been catastrophically negligent, and at worst, knowingly misrepresented a repairable fleet as scrap in order to trigger an insurance and grant clawback worth £11.4 million. The insurer, reading the same articles, opened its own investigation and demanded its money back. The grant body did likewise. The fraud became a matter for people whose letterheads make men like Strand go pale. Calder Transit did not survive it. The Calder name, which was the only thing Strand had ever truly traded on, became a liability overnight, and the company was broken up and sold for parts within the year, which Fay found a fitting fate for a firm that had made its money breaking up and selling for parts a fleet that had only needed an 11-pound sensor and someone willing to listen to it. Strand himself was not jailed in the end. These things rarely end in jail for men in good coats, but he was finished in the only world he cared about, disqualified as a director, named in 3 sets of proceedings. His name, when it came up as a cautionary tale, the man who sold a £10 million fleet for £1,000 because he was too proud to believe the woman who'd told him the truth. Fay heard much later that he'd left the country. She didn't think about him as often as she'd expected to. That was the surprise. She'd imagined his ruin would fill her up, and instead it just quietly drained away the last of the heat she'd been carrying and left her with room for other things. But the number 9 still runs. It runs on the buses. In fact, 3 of the original 12 serve the Western Network's quieter routes, and one of them by a small act of bureaucratic charity that Fay arranged and never mentioned, carries the fleet number 9 and runs out to Marbeck and the hospital and back, clean and quiet, the way her father would have wanted, the way the spreadsheets had said was impossible. She took Daisy with her on its first day in service. They rode it out to the estate and back, sitting at the front like kids, and an old woman got on at the hospital with 3 bags of shopping and a stick, and Daisy got up and helped her with the bags without being asked, and the woman thanked her and said wasn't it nice to have a proper bus on the 9 again. The old one had been so unreliable, breaking down all the time. This one won't break down, Daisy told her. They all break down, love, the woman said comfortably, settling in. Everything breaks down eventually. Not if you understand why, said Daisy, who was 19 and had learned a great deal in 6 months. Most things aren't broken. Most things are just misunderstood by someone who didn't want to look properly. The old woman laughed and said she sounded like a clever clogs, and Daisy said she'd been taught by the best, and Fay looked out of the window at the estate going by, her father's estate, the route he'd driven for 31 years, and didn't say anything, because the thing in her chest was too full for words, and she'd never been one for explaining herself anyway. Fay Whitmore Engineering employs 41 people now, and the thing it is known for, the thing operators across the country quietly call it about, is the diagnosis of faults that everyone else has given up on. The ghosts, the intermittents, the machines that other firms have declared beyond economic repair. She keeps the laminated receipt framed on the wall of her office. £1,000, 12 vehicles, sold as seen. Visitors assume it's a joke, and she lets them, because the real meaning of it is not a thing she can explain to a visitor in the time a visitor has. But she explained it once properly, to Daisy, on a late night when they were the last 2 in the building, And Daisy asked the question young people ask their mentors when they're trying to work out how to live. "How did you know?" Daisy said. "How did you know it would work? You bet everything on those buses. Your money 2 years, all of it. If the mandate had been delayed or the rules had changed or Pennine hadn't bid, you'd have had 12 buses in a shed and nothing else." "How were you so sure?" "I wasn't sure," Faye said. "That's the part everyone gets wrong about it afterwards. They tell it like I always knew I'd win. I didn't. I knew I was right about the buses, that I was certain of, because I'd read the data, and the data doesn't lie even when people do. But whether being right would ever be worth anything, that I didn't know. That's the bet I actually made. Not on the buses. On the idea that eventually, somewhere, the world would need the truth I was holding and would pay for it." She looked at the receipt on the wall. "Most people lose that bet, Daisy. That's the honest part nobody puts in the story. Plenty of people are right and die with no one ever caring. Being right isn't enough. You have to be right, and you have to keep the evidence, and you have to be patient past the point where patience feels like stupidity. And then you have to be standing in the right room when the world finally turns around and goes, 'Wait, who understood this all along?'" Daisy thought about it. "And if the world never turns around?" "Then you were still right," Faye said. "And being right is its own thing, separate from being rewarded for it. You'd like the reward. I won't lie to you, the reward is nice." She smiled, tired at the end of a long, good day. "But the being right was never theirs to take from me. That's the only thing I knew for certain, the whole way through. They took my job and my reputation and 2 years of my life. They could never once touch the fact that I was right about the buses. That was always mine. Everything else was just waiting for the price to catch up." She turned off her office light. Down in the yard, lined up under the security lamps, sat the firm's small fleet, including one quiet single-decker that didn't need to be there for any business reason and that she kept anyway, Fleet number 9, clean and ready for the morning. "Come on," she said. "I'll drop you home. We've got the Sheffield job in the morning. They've got 6 trams nobody can fix." She paused at the door, and there was something in her face that was almost her father's, the look of someone who has found the work they were made for and intends to die doing it. "Everyone's already told them it's hopeless," she said. "Which means we're probably the only ones who'll bother to look properly." And they went out together into the dark, the old engineer's daughter and the girl she was teaching to listen, to go and find out what everyone else had been too sure to see.